Smoking on our Miami balcony at 2 a.m., I, Emma, 19, teased my stepdad Ron, 57, ex-astronomer, to read the stars. I leaned close. His hand hit my back. Sky spun wild. Mom's asleep. 2 weeks flared hot. Too hot. Bar night broke us. What crashed it fast? You'll gasp. The night was sticky in Miami, the kind that clings to your skin, and I, Emma, 19, was out on the balcony of our high-rise, leaning on the railing, a cigarette glowing between my fingers. It was past 2 a.m., the city humming below, and Mom was passed out inside, exhausted from her late shift at the office. Her last call a tired bet I'd stay out of trouble before her work trip ended, way off. My stepdad, Ron, a 57-year-old ex-astronomer who'd traded telescopes for a quieter life, had always looked at me with eyes that lingered too long, not quite parental, and it stirred a thrill I didn't name. I'd caught him staring again at dinner, and tonight, I was restless. The balcony door slid open, and Ron stepped out, lugging his old telescope, its tripod scraping the tiles. He set it up, his faded flannel open over a worn tee, gray hair catching the moonlight. He didn't look at me, just focused the lens, muttering about a clear sky. Bet I'd never seen Orion like this. I smirked, flicked ash over the edge, go flirty, saying he'd read the stars like a pro. Bet he'd show me something wild. He glanced over, his hand brushing the scope, smirking, saying wild wasn't my thing. Bet I'd blink at the first constellation. I stubbed out the cigarette, sauntered closer, my shorts and tank top shifting as I leaned near the telescope, teasing that blinking was my spark. Bet he'd light it up. He smirked, adjusted the lens, his elbow grazing my arm, muttering sparking was my dodge. Bet I'd lose the stars. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying losing was my vibe. Bet he'd guide me anyway. He pointed to Orion's belt, his voice low, and I leaned in, my hair brushing his cheek, pretending to squint, teasing he looked hot teaching. Bet he'd mapped wilder skies. His hand slid to my lower back, light but steady, guiding me to the eyepiece, saying I'd see better. Bet I'd fall for it. My stomach flipped, heat rushing, and I bumped his hip, flirty, saying falling was my rush. Bet he'd catch me starry-eyed. He smirked, his fingers lingering, warm through my tank, muttering catching was my trap. Bet I'd reel him out. I grinned, pressed closer, my knee brushing his, teasing that reeling was my thrill. Bet he'd tug it tight. He shifted, his arm brushing mine, saying tugging was my game. Bet I'd spin him off orbit. The city pulsed below, stars sharp, and I tilted my head, my shoulder grazing his chest, saying he was too steady. Bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, turned the scope, his hand brushing my arm again, teasing, muttering flaring was my mess. Bet I'd burn this night. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying burning was my spark. Bet he'd fan it anyway. He leaned in, his knee nudging mine, muttering fanning was my hustle. Bet I'd blaze him out. I smirked, my hand grazing his on the scope, teasing that blazing was my win. Bet he'd glow with me. The balcony hummed, the air thick, and I stepped back, grabbing my lighter, twirling it, saying he looked damn good starlit. Bet he'd teach me more. He smirked, packed the scope, his fingers brushing my wrist, teasing, saying teaching was my fantasy. Bet I'd drift off course. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying drifting was my play. Bet he'd steer me back. He stood, his arm brushing my shoulder, muttering steering was my trap. Bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, bumped his elbow one last time, flirty, saying hooking was my rush. Bet he'd bite it hard. The night deepened, the city glowing, and I lingered, knowing I'd lit something, stars up, tension hotter. Mom slept inside, and I headed in, leaving him with the scope, his eyes still on me, and I knew I'd hooked him. Sky clear, stakes high. 2 days after the balcony spark, I was still wired from that starry night. Ron's hand on my back, his low voice mapping constellations, had lodged in my head like a stubborn song. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last call a distracted. Bet I'd keep the lights on, not even close. I wandered into the kitchen of our Miami high-rise that morning, barefoot in a loose tank and shorts, the air sharp with coffee and citrus. Ron stood by the counter, flipping through a dog-eared book on galaxies, his faded button-up open over a plain tee, glasses perched low. He didn't look up, just muttered I'd better not swipe his brew. Bet I'd burn my tongue. I grinned, slid onto a stool across from him, my knee brushing the counter's edge, flirty, saying he looked hot with his stars. Bet he'd chart me one too. He smirked, pushed the book aside, and said stars didn't flirt. Bet I'd misread the whole sky. I leaned forward, my elbow nudging the counter near his arm, teasing that flirting was my orbit. bet he'd align it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing a mug by my wrist, fingers lingering, and said aligning was my dodge, bet I'd spin him off course. I bumped the book with my finger, flirty, saying spinning was my light, bet he'd track it sharp. He smirked, slid the mug my way, his knuckles grazing mine, muttering lighting was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this roast. I took a sip, the coffee bitter and warm, teasing, saying owing was my hook, bet he'd brew it with that grin. He leaned on the counter, his shoulders shifting closer, teasing back, saying brewing was my hustle, bet I'd scald him dry. I grinned, bumped my knee against the stool, flirty, saying scalding was my kick, bet he'd sip it anyway. He smirked, grabbed his own mug, his arm brushing the book near mine, muttering sipping was my trap, bet I'd reel him out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd tug it tight. The kitchen hummed, sunlight slicing through, and I spun the book open, pointing at a star map, my shoulder grazing his, saying he looked damn good decoding, bet he'd mapped wilder nights. He smirked, turned a page, his elbow nudging mine, teasing that nights didn't sass, bet I'd blur this one. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying blurring was my vibe, bet he'd focus it anyway. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm as he traced a constellation, warm and steady, muttering focusing was my dream, bet I'd drift off fast. I leaned in, my knee pressing the counter by his, flirty, saying drifting was my thrill, bet he'd steer me back. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he set the book down, saying I'd better watch it, I bet I'd tangle this morning. I smirked, grabbed a spoon, stirred my coffee slow, teasing that tangling was my spark, bet he'd flip it too. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, muttering flipping was my chaos, bet I'd spill it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my win, bet he'd mop it anyway. He smirked, leaned back, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering mopping was my trap, bet I'd soak him quick. The coffee steamed, the room bright, and I stayed there, sipping, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the book, teasing, saying flaring was my mess, bet I'd tip this counter. I grinned, bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He leaned closer, his knee nudging mine, muttering holding was my play, bet I'd slip anyway. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my game, bet he'd catch me sharp. The morning pulsed, tension simmering, and I stood, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my star. He smirked, turned the page, his hand brushing mine, muttering chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He didn't pull away, tension humming, and I knew I'd hooked him, coffee cold, stakes high. For days after the coffee flirt, the Miami afternoon burned bright. The backyard of our high-rise a concrete patch with a scruffy palm and a rickety table where I sat, sketching on a notepad, the air thick with salt and heat. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last text a brisk bet I'd kept the place tidy, not a chance. I'd been turning over Ron's starry smirks, his quick brushes, and they'd rooted deeper than I'd meant. He came out, hauling his telescope to tweak under the shade, his faded button-up rolled to his elbows, khakis scuffed, glasses glinting. He muttered I'd better not scribble his lens, bet I'd smudge it blind. I grinned, flipped a page, flirty, saying he looked sharp with that scope, bet he'd spot me in a galaxy. He smirked, twisted a knob, and said galaxies didn't flirt, bet I'd blur the whole sky. I leaned back, my sandal brushing the table leg near his, teasing that flirting was my comet, bet he'd track it anyway. He glanced over, his hand brushing the tripod by my notepad, fingers hovering close, and said tracking was my sidestep, bet I'd throw him off orbit. I slid my pencil across the page, flirty, saying throwing was my flair, bet he'd map it tight. He smirked, adjusted the lens, his arm grazing the table's edge, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd owe him for this focus. I stood, sketching a quick star, my hip brushing the table near him, teasing that owing was my angle, bet he'd align it with that grin. He took the pencil, his fingers brushing mine, teasing back, saying aligning was my bait, bet I'd lure him out. I grinned, leaned closer, my knee nudging his chair, flirty, saying luring was my glow, bet he'd chase it anyway. He smirked, set the pencil down, his elbow brushing my arm, muttering chasing was my snare, bet I'd hook him too far. I tapped the scope, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd reel it sharp. The sun glared, palm fronds rustling, and I circled the table, my shoulder brushing his back, saying he looked damn good scoping, bet he'd charted wilder nights than this. He smirked, turned the scope, his hand brushing my wrist, teasing that nights didn't sass, bet I'd cloud this one. I grinned, leaned in, my elbow pressing his side, flirty, saying clouding was my vibe, bet he'd clear it anyway. He shifted, his fingers grazing my arm as he tweaked a dial, warm and steady, muttering clearing was my dream, bet I'd drift off quick. I smirked, pressed my knee against his chair, flirty, saying drifting was my thrill, bet he'd anchor me. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he packed the scope, saying I'd better watch it, bet I'd tangle this yard. I smirked, grabbed my notepad, doodling a spiral, teasing that tangling was my light, bet he'd spin it too. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, muttering spinning was my mess, bet I'd blur it first. I leaned in, flirty, saying blurring was my win, bet he'd sharpen it. He smirked, set the pad down, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering sharpening was my trap, bet I'd snag him clean. The heat pulsed, dusk creeping, and I stayed close, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, turned, his hand brushing my arm, light, teasing, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd tip this table. I grinned, tapped his scope, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, leaned in, his knee brushing mine, muttering holding was my hustle, bet I'd slip anyway. I grinned, nudged his elbow, teasing, saying slipping was my play, bet he'd catch me tight. The yard quieted, stars fading in, and I stepped back, grabbing my water, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my flare. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the pad, teasing, saying chasing was my game, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, flipped the page, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He stood, scope packed, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him, stars out, stakes soaring. 3 days after the backyard telescope tease, the Miami night was warm and restless, the living room bathed in the soft flicker of a muted TV, casting shadows across the worn rug. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last voicemail a tired bet I'd kept the chaos low but dead wrong. I'd been savoring Ron's quiet smirks, his subtle nudges, and they'd settled deeper than I'd planned. I slouched on the couch, legs tucked under, sipping a glass of red wine I'd swiped from the kitchen, my loose tee and shorts slipping as I shifted. Ron came in from the balcony, a bottle of wine in hand, his faded flannel unbuttoned over a plain tee, glasses fogged from the humid air. He set it down, his fingers brushing the table near my glass, muttering I'd better not drain it, I bet I'd pass out first. I grinned, swirled my wine, flirty, saying he looked smooth pouring, bet he'd uncork a wild night. He smirked, dropped into the armchair across, his knee grazing the coffee table, and said nights didn't flirt, I bet I'd talk it dry. I leaned forward, my elbow nudging the table by his arm, teasing that talking was my meteor, bet he'd sip at Starry. He sipped his glass, his hand brushing the bottle near my wrist, teasing back, saying sipping was my orbit, bet I'd reel him off course. I swung my legs down, my foot brushing his chair, flirty, saying reeling was my glow, bet he'd chase it anyway. He smirked, leaned in, his arms stretching across the table, muttering chasing was my snare, bet I'd hook him out. The wine warmed my throat, and I slid closer, my shoulder shifting near his sleeve, saying he looked damn fine unwinding, bet he'd mapped louder skies than this. He smirked, refilled his glass, his fingers grazing the bottle by my hand, teasing that skies didn't sass, bet I'd cloud this one. I bumped his knee with mine, flirty, saying clouding was my pulse, bet he'd clear it sharp. He turned the TV volume down, his arm brushing mine, muttering clearing was my lure, bet I'd drift off fast. I grinned, pressed my elbow into his side, flirty, teasing that drifting was my rush, bet he'd anchor me tight. He leaned back, his eyes catching mine, saying I'd better slow it, bet I'd spin this room wild. I smirked, bumped his shoulder, flirty, and took a slow sip, teasing that spinning was my flair, bet he'd roll with it. He smirked, he shifted, his hand brushing my wrist as he grabbed the bottle, muttering rolling was my bait, bet I'd drag him too far. I leaned in, my knee pressing his chair, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd tag along anyway. He smirked, his fingers tapping near mine, teasing, muttering tagging was my win, bet I'd snag him clean. The TV buzzed, a late-night ad droning, and I stretched, my arm brushing his chest, saying he looked too calm, bet he'd spark if I pushed. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, warm, muttering sparking was my tangle, bet I'd tip this couch. I bumped his hip with my knee, flirty, saying tipping was my vibe, bet he'd hold it steady. He shifted, his hand grazing my elbow, teasing, growling holding was my dream, bet I'd slip quick. I smirked, nudged his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying slipping was my rush, bet he'd catch me anyway. The night pulsed, wine softening the edges, and I stayed close, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my light. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the glass, teasing, saying chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He leaned in, his arm brushing my back, muttering biting was my trap, bet I'd twist him out. I laughed, teasing, bumped his knee, saying twisting was my play, bet he'd swing it anyway. The room hummed, tension thick, and I leaned back, knowing I'd hooked him, wine low, stakes high. The day before Mom was set to return from her work trip, her flu finally easing. I'd been riding the high of 2 weeks of flirty exchanges with Ron in our Miami high-rise. Her last text was a curt bet I'd kept the chaos down, not even close. That afternoon, I'd coaxed him into a night out, craving the pulse of a bar over our quiet nights. I slipped into a fitted top and jeans, and he drove us to a dive downtown, his usual flannel swapped for a dark button-up, hair slicked back, looking sharper than I'd expected. He parked in the neon-lit lot, muttering I'd better not start a scene, bet I'd pull him into one. I grinned to a flirty, nudging his arm as we stepped out, saying he looked too cool for this joint, bet he'd light it up with me. The bar vibrated, strobes flashing, bass thumping, bodies swaying, and I weaved through, tugging his sleeve, teasing he'd better move, bet he'd dance me dizzy. He smirked, followed close, his hand brushing my shoulder to steer me, saying dizzy was my orbit, bet I'd spin him out. I leaned into the bar counter, my hip grazing his, flirty, and ordered beers, saying he'd need one, bet he'd loosen for me. He took it, his fingers brushing mine as I handed it over, teasing that loosening was my snare, bet I'd reel him flat. I grinned, bumped his elbow, saying reeling was my flair, bet he'd chase it down. The music surged, and I pulled him to the dance floor, the crowd pulsing, my hips swaying as I turned to him, teasing he looked stiff, bet he'd groove with me. He smirked, stepped in, his hands hovering near my waist, light, guiding, muttering grooving was my chaos, bet I'd trip him up. I laughed, spun closer, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying tripping was my spark, bet he'd catch it quick. His grip settled, loose but warm, his knee nudging mine, teasing that catching was my trap, bet I'd twist him raw. I grinned, my hand grazing his arm, saying twisting was my rush, bet he'd hold on anyway. The lights strobed, sweat beading, and I swayed, my back brushing his front, teasing he was too steady, bet he'd flare for this. He smirked, his hand sliding to my hips, light through my top, muttering flaring was my mess, bet I'd burn this place. I spun back, my elbow pressing his ribs, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it slow. His fingers tapped my waist, teasing, his voice low, saying fanning was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, teasing that blazing was my win, bet he'd stick for it. The song slowed, the crowd thinning, and I stayed close, breathless, saying he looked damn hot in this, bet he'd take me home wild. He smirked, his hand lingering on my hip, light, muttering wild was my chaos, bet I'd drag him too far. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying dragging was my vibe, bet he'd chase it anyway. He leaned closer, his arm brushing mine, muttering chasing was my play, bet I'd twist him up. I laughed, spun away, heading for the bar, calling back he'd miss my heat, bet he'd catch up. He trailed me, the bar humming, and I grabbed another beer, leaning on the counter, my elbow brushing his arm, teasing he was too calm, bet he'd spark for me. He smirked, took one too, his hand brushing mine, muttering sparking was my trap, bet I'd snag him tight. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying snagging was my rush, bet he'd drink it down. The night roared, tension thick, and I felt it surge, his pull was electric, and I wanted more, my pulse racing with the beat. I swayed, saying he was too good, bet he'd light my sky. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine, teasing that lighting was my game, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, flirty, knowing I'd hooked him, bar loud, stakes louder. After the bar, Mom's return loomed, her work trip cut short, her last text betting I'd stayed chill, clueless to my 2-week spark with Ron in our Miami high-rise. We'd stumbled home past 3 a.m., buzzed from beers, the truck lurching as I'd teased he'd owned the dance floor, bet he'd claim me next. He'd smirked, parked rough, and we'd tripped inside, my head spinning from booze. In my jeans and top, I swayed in the hall, jacket off, flirty, saying he'd ruled, bet he'd take me now. He smirked, slammed the door, tea tight, muttering taking was my hustle, bet I'd wreck it. I grinned, lurched closer, hip brushing his, teasing wrecking was my flair, bet he'd grab it. He grabbed my wrists, light, pulling me to his room, growling I'd gone too far, bet I'd sink us. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest, saying sinking was my rush, bet he'd dive in. He pushed the door open, hand grazing my arm, guiding me in. I flopped onto his bed, top shifting, teasing he looked wild, bet he'd catch me here. He sank beside me, knee nudging mine, hands near my hips, muttering catching was my mess, bet I'd twist him out. Headlights flashed, Mom's voice roared, home early, yelling where we were. I froze, scramble off, heart pounding, muttering she's back, bet we're done. Ron jumped up, cursing, saying timing was hell. Mom stormed in, eyes blazing, screaming why I was in his room, drunk? I stammered it was nothing. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Ron he'd crossed it, out, we're gone. She hauled me to my room, stuffed my bag, shouting we're leaving, now, and dragged me to the car, peeling out, leaving him in the dark. I slumped, buzzed dead, knowing I'd lit it, I bet it burned us.